Ranking anime brothers. The brothers in anime. So now I have the brothers of anime. Oh shit. At number 20, we got Dabi. Dabi tried to kill Shoto, his brother. Alright? Shoto can't help the fact that his father's, dumbass, idiot, caused him to burn in the fucking, and then, other people, came and, patched him up. He went back to the house and he saw them, basically getting over the fact that he died. They had wrote him off as dead, and that hurt him. And then now he's like, fighting against the heroes. He's a villain, right? He's fighting against his own brother. If I were him, I wouldn't even try to fight him. I'd try to fight my, Endeavor, because Endeavor's the one that's wrong. Not Shoto. Shoto can't help what his dad did, But Shoto's still fighting on the side of good and all of that. But still, there's brothers on the list who are better, brothers. So I got him at number 20. At 19, I have Sesshomaru. He's one of those high-class, sophisticated demons, right? Well respected, the ones who don't, agree with him fear him and shit because he's a real demon, real dog. We know about Sesshomaru over here. But he is not a good brother. He tried to kill Inuyasha on many occasions for the sword called the Tensaiga. He believed he needed to wield the sword because he was the one that was more powerful and worthy of the sword because he walked like their father. Inuyasha didn't even give a fuck about their father. Like, he did, but Inuyasha doesn't understand who their father was. But Sesshomaru does. And he hated Inuyasha because he didn't know, and also because he's a half-breed. And half-breeds are not fucking seen as a good thing in their, eyes. That's something that they despise. Higher-ranking demons and shit, right? In Inuyasha. So, he's at 19. Tried to kill Inuyasha, but he then, helped him out and other things, and the relationship, grew a little bit better. They still stayed away from each other. He would never just hang out with Inuyasha and be cool with him. They had to team up against Naraku, who was going to destroy, the whole, feudal era. The world that they live in and shit. So they had to team up against him for that. And then they had to stop the Grim Comet, later on in Yashahime, but that was it. And they went their separate ways right after that. They didn't want nothing to do with each other. They weren't gonna ask about shit. They were like, man, I'm like, and Sesshomaru himself is the one actually. He's like, I'm out of there. Illumi's at 18. Illumi, Zoldyck, he wanted to manipulate his brother's life. You won't become a hunter. You need to become an assassin like me, and what our father, did for you and what I did for you growing up. You need to do that. You need to stay alive so you can assassinate people. You'll run away from people who are stronger than you. Because I said that's what you need to do. You're not to fucking live your own life and do your own things and have friends. You cannot do shit like that. You won't be doing that. You'll be just like me. You'll hunt, you'll kill your friends, if, one day. And that's what I see in you. I see you as being just like the rest of us. You're nothing special. You don't get special treatment. You don't get to, go out and do shit like that. He also sees his sister, Alika, Nanika, as a weapon. That power is mine. If I can get Killua away from her and figure out how to tap into that ability, then it's mine. At the end of Hunter x Hunter, the anime, you see him laughing hysterically because he knows that power exists and he's related to her. And he has a better chance of getting that than other people, and that's true. But it would never happen because Alika doesn't like him. She only likes Killua. So Illumi's at 18 on this list. 17 is Zeref. Zeref was cool, at least at first, right? He brought his brother back to life. But then he had him brought back as a demon, had him brought back to kill him, to kill Acnologia, become a dragon slayer and train under Igneo, brought back as a weapon, as a means to, for him to fight against if he felt like it, for him to kill him if he felt like it. Zeref was kind of going through it. He had lived for a long time and shit, right? He brought his brother back, but in order for him to kill Acnologia and for him to kill him eventually too, because he's actually a demon. Natsu is, you were created by me. You were died and came back to life because of me. And he was, going against his brother and what his brother was doing. It's crazy too because Zeref was actually the one who helped, like, find Fairy Tail, because he bestowed powers upon Mavis and everything. But then he's fighting against Natsu later on in the guild hall because he wants to reset everything and then act like everything never happened. Everything, restart everything. Go back to when they were kids and everything else. But Natsu's like, no, I live my life and I have friends and I have other things. You might be my brother and all that, but you're telling me that my life didn't mean anything. You did all that shit for nothing. And they end up fighting each other. Zeref ended up passing away and shit. He did bring his brother back, which is a good thing, but he was trying to, fuck his life up. So that's number 17. At 16, I got Nozel Silva. He had his other siblings beside him, but he wouldn't have Noelle beside him because she looks like his mother. Now, he wanted to protect Noelle, right? That's what they say. He wanted to protect her. He's like, hey, you are worthless. You can't fight. You can't do this. You're going to stay over here and do other things. You're not a magic knight. You can't be like me and Nebra and Solid. You can't be like us. We're built different. You ain't. You're going to stay over there and, be the little baby or whatever. He didn't want to see her pass away, but he, kind of, shunned her and, put her down a lot. You're a disgrace to our family and all this, And then he, like, did that so much to where his other siblings then did it too, harassed her all the time, to where this girl don't even like her family no more. Then he created those two weaklings that run around beside him, But Noelle Silva, then since, found out that his sister did know how to control her powers. She was learning how to control her powers better. And he was like, you know what? I guess you're, becoming something, But he's at 17, or 16, my bad. 15, we have Choso from JJK. Choso almost killed Ichigo. We've seen that shit. He basically died. If he didn't have Sukuna inside of him, he would have been dead. He gave him the hands and shit, boys. You know that. You saw what he fucking did to Yuji. But he saw an image and he was like, you know what? We are related. We have similar blood because they do. It has something to do with Kenjaku. And he's a body snatcher. See, you'll find that out in, maybe season 3. You'll find out on season 3. He's a body snatcher. He does stuff. He does shit too much. He fucks around too many different ways. He manipulated their lives. Yuji, he doesn't know that he's his brother because Todo's also calling him his brother, and Todo means it in a different way. But Choso actually, like, feels it inside of him. He's like, I know me and him are like kind of connected by like blood, you know, and he's a blood manipulator too. And then since then, he's like, you know, tried to defend Yuji and other things because, like, you know, and then he, you know, kind of like, I don't know, he probably should have went with his other brothers that day to fight against them, you know. And I'm just saying that because it showed it in the anime too. He's like, Iso, you live for Kechizu. Kechizu, you live for me, and I live for you, Iso. And they were all three together, and he was like, we'll, you know, be together and we'll fight, you know, we'll work with the cursed spirits right now, you know, but if it works in our benefit later to serve the sorcerers, then that's what we'll do, you know, because they're cursed room death paintings. They're like half-breeds, essentially, you know, but he's at 15 because he could have went there with his brothers, but he was sitting down kicking back with Maito and Kenjaku, and he felt them die, you know. I don't know. Not the worst, but there's better brothers on the list. Byakuya. See, he wanted to kill his sister because she wasn't following the Kuchiki codes and shit, right? You know, we're a noble clan. You know, we can't be the ones that are laughing stock. We have to follow things to a T. We have to hold ourselves in high regard. You gave your energy away to a human. That's frowned upon because we don't do that. He then wanted her to get her head chopped off. And after all that trouble he went through to get her, he went through the trouble of, like, you know, going into the Sword Academy. He's like, you're Isane's sister. You know, I love Isane. You know, you're now my sister. You know, you're gonna, you know, he calls the Kuchiki name and everything else. You know. But he realized after Ichigo, you know, fucked with him, Ichigo didn't even want to kill him. You know, he did a little bit, but he was like, you know, why would you ever do that shit to your sister? You know, but since then, he changed. He even defended her life. You know, he saved her from, you know, Arrancar number 7, Zomari. He also saved, or, you know, he taught her about Bankai and how, you know, she's a newbie at it, so she needs to, like, be cool. And when she, like, powers down, she needs to be slow about it because a quick change in temperature can, like, kill her, you know. But, you know, their relationship could be a little bit better, I guess. Not the worst, though. You know, and they ain't even, like, related like that. It's like, you know, he liked her sister, and her sister was, like, you know, they were blood relatives. They looked the same. You know, and that's how he ended up finding her. And he was like, you know what? You can be a part of my family. But then he was doing nothing. You know, he almost killed the bitch. You know, that's kind of, you know, not what you want to do. But 13 is Elfman. Elfman Strauss. You know, he lost his mind and killed his sister. You know, essentially he didn't. But, you know, at that point in time when we first meet Elfman, he did. And he still was getting saved by his older sister. You know, he wasn't, you know, more powerful than his older sister. He wanted to be, but he never quite did that. You know, and he does care about his sisters, you know. I want to take pressure off my sister so I can win. He did win fights though, you know. He didn't want to see his sisters with somebody else, you know, so he fought against Bacchus and he defeated him. He ain't the worst, brother. And then after Lizana came back, he wasn't gonna let that shit happen again. But then he got possessed by Celia, and she was controlling his mind, and she almost had him kill, you know, his sisters again. You know, it's just a bad look for him, you know. And he's not a bad guy. He ain't. He's not. But the other brothers on here are just better than him, y'all. You know, I got him at 13. And then Sokka's at 12. You know, Sokka's kind of the same as Elfman as far as, you know, he couldn't protect his sister, but he did the best he could, you know, and she was the one, you know, protecting him because she had waterbending techniques. He didn't have none of that. You know, he's a warrior, but he ain't like a Koda. He eventually becomes like a Koda eventually, but it took some time, and he had to learn from that one guy who was in the White Lotus, who's a swordsman, and he became a swordsman, a better boomerang expert. And he was there for Katara the whole time. He was upset at Aang when he burnt Katara. He was, also, upset at her or not her, but he was upset at Zuko when, he was trying to, get back in, because she, told him that, she thought Zuko had changed, but he didn't. And then, he was kind of like, I don't know about this, letting Zuko back on because he tricked my sister, with him, it's just like, I don't know. The other guys are just better, but he was there for her. He was. And they stayed by each other. They had a great relationship, I just think the other brothers did a little more, for them. For their siblings. And Sokka only has one sibling, right? Kuwabara is a good brother too. Kuwabara is a younger brother though, He could have let the fucking, world burn and shit, because he was requested to go to the Dark Tournament, and, Tagoro made it, clear that he would kill him and Yusuke and everybody he knew. And he ran that shit by his sister, and he's like, hey, I understand I have to go to school and shit, but there's no school to go back to if we're all dead, because these demons want us to, like, fight in this tournament. And if we don't fight in this tournament, you'll just kill us anyway. So we might as well go there and, do it. And she was like, you know what? And it's because of Yusuke too. But he's like, fighting to, protect her life too, not just his. Because Tagoro said he was going to kill everybody they knew. And he was going to do that. He did that for her. And later on, he was like, still trying to, be with Yusuke and help him out so that the, human world wouldn't be affected. Because he's a human just like, Yusuke is and everybody else. That ain't Kurama and Hiei. And, they don't want to see the world, be destroyed. He was considering her life, too. Even though he was focused on Yukina, right? He's still, his sister too. But number 10, I got Hashirama Senju. He witnesses other brothers die. And, at a certain point, he was like, damn, me and Tobirama have to be, like, close. Because our younger brothers died. Because we were weak. We allowed other people to, get to us or whatever. And he, witnessed a lot of his brothers die. Madara did too, but he, was also going to give his life, after, Izuna died. He was like, we both have one brother left. You lost your brother. You want me to kill myself to prove that I am, a man of my word. I don't want to die, and I ain't going to kill my brother, who's my younger brother, so I'm going to kill myself. And then, Madara was like, no, it's fine. And, they had a great relationship. His brother then became the second Hokage, even though, and Hashirama didn't like Tobirama in that, he was a little more, like, worried about what the Uchiha would do. Because, Tobirama took it different ways. And he was like, brother, I don't know. We have to keep a close eye on these animals. And, Hashirama was like, it's all right because we have, come to agreements and we've established this, village together upon what me and Madara, had as children. They, had the same will of fire, let's protect the leaf and everything else. But, Hashirama didn't put sanctions on, Uchihas. He didn't, wasn't watching them really hard or anything like that. He was looking at people as, we're all villagers. We wear that bandana and we're all the same people. That's how Hashirama viewed it. But his brother wasn't like that. But he didn't hate his brother. He hated what his brother was, like, causing and shit. Because then later on when they're recouped, he's like, I told you not to fight the Uchiha. And he was like, but brother, this and that and this and that. And he's like, but if you wouldn't have did that, maybe they wouldn't have even had thoughts of being, uprising on us and other things. You're basically, he's saying to his brother, your actions and what you've done, caused that shit to happen later on. He's at number 10. And at number 9, I have Android 17. Android 17 was cool with the sister. They were close. They went and they got, turned into robots together. They woke up and they killed their creator because they weren't going to listen to him. They were going to run around and do what they needed to. And then they were going to kill Goku. But then, in this timeline, they were, kind of fucking around, doing other things. Then Cell showed up. Cell absorbed 17. He believed he was, the strongest of the band. But he got absorbed and then other things happened, right? He liked his sister, She went and she got, with another guy. And he was like, left to do whatever he did. So he started a farm and, or he was protecting animals and shit. But he never went back to his sister. He could have made attempts. She could have made attempts. But I guess, as a brother, he was like, I don't want to mess up what she has going on. She has kids. I'm doing other things. I might as well focus on me. We were already together for a long time, and, it's time for us to grow up and do our own things. The other people are just better on this list. But I got him at number 9, because I didn't forget about Android 17. And then he saved his fucking sister's life by, staying in the ring, and people forget about that part, but I didn't forget about that. He's the winner of the Tournament of Power, folks. He was the last one standing. But number 8, I got Itachi. At number 8, Itachi, he went through a lot. And he did it because he wanted to protect the leaf, but he also wanted to protect his brother. That's why he asked Hiruzen. He said, before I do this, I want to protect my brother. I don't want you fucking with my brother. I'll kill everybody else, but don't fuck with him. And he was like, okay. And after that day, it was all right. For the Leaf Village, but not for him. He ended up, his eyes started to, fade away and other things because he joined the Akatsuki. He had to use his eyes more and other things. He fought against his brother, and it wasn't to kill his brother. He didn't want to kill Sasuke. He wanted to bless him with powers. The Mangekyu Sharingan, because that's a powerful weapon that he can then use to protect himself with. He let him know some things, He had to push Sasuke in that fight so he could awaken those powers himself, right? And he did. But that was because Itachi did that to him. He understood that his brother was focused on getting revenge on him. He wanted that. He wanted that so that he could then become a powerful man in his own right. Sasuke could, and he did. Sasuke then became on par with Naruto. Slightly weaker though because of the, plot armor, right? But, Itachi, helped his brother out in the end. Sasuke had to go through a lot, but, at the end of the day, he did too, and he was, decent, he said, I still love you either way, if you choose to destroy the leaf or not, but I wanted to protect it. So Itachi's words did hit him at the end of the day. He was just, this boy was, really about being stronger than Naruto. He just didn't like, he didn't like the way the story was written, kind of like some other people. But, we can't argue. It's called Naruto. But we can. But Itachi ain't a bad brother, But what he did was kind of, he could have might have handled it a little bit differently. He could have took Sasuke with him maybe, or, You know, I don't know. He could have done other things, but in the quick, because like things were happening fast too. That's what some people don't understand. So, you know, he did what he had to do in the time he had. But at number 7, I have Ichigo. Ichigo is a good brother because he took the powers from Rukia so he could defend his family. That's why that's why he became a Soul Reaper in the first place, so he could defend, his sisters, Yuzu and Karin. He was already doing that, but he needed to defend against demons. These are hollows, fools. He needed extra power. He wasn't gonna fight in this human form against that shit. He needed to, get out. And he did that, and then after that, he was, protecting his sisters. There was even that movie where Ichigo, went to hell to save his sister who had, chain on her. You know, she was dead, almost, but she was freed. Ichigo went to hell to save his sister. He fought against Aizen to save his sister. He did all that shit for, to save those, people in the world. And those people are, mainly his sister, too. His sisters, both of them. He ain't a, bad protagonist. He's actually a good protagonist. He just ain't loud as much. But he is loud. He's still loud. Don't think, I know Ichigo's loud about, things, but he ain't like that. Like, he's doing it solely to protect his family and his friends. And he did that. He protected his brothers and sister, or his sister. He don't have no brothers. But he did that for Yuzu and Karin. He was there for them when, their mother was passed and they understood that their mother was gone. And, they, kind of did their, handled it differently or whatever. But at the end of the day, they knew that Ichigo cared about him. And they cared about their brother because he cared about them. But at number 6, I got Chizuru. Oh, not Chizuru. What the fuck? That's not on this list. That was another one. I got Shinra. That's who it is. Shinra Kasakabe. Knew that his brother was gone. But he always, had a feeling that his brother was still out there. He had a suspicion. He was like, my brother still might be out there. And one day he found his brother, a white-haired little boy who could, freeze time. And he was like, that's my brother. Do you remember me? And he's like, I don't know if I remember you. I think I do, but you are my enemy, because he was growing up in the white clad. So then he had his own way of seeing things. He was the enemy. Shin was like, no, you're not my enemy, but if I have to fight you and knock some sense into you, I will. He didn't want to fight his brother, but he had no choice because his brother was going to kill him. I ain't going to let you kill me. What the fuck? I'm trying to save the world too. And you're with the wrong people, that type of thing. And Shinra's a good brother, because he's thinking about him all the time. Similar to kind of like Towa from, Yashihime. He's thinking about his brother a lot. Number 5 is Gohan. Gohan was there for Goten to look up to and, help raise by Chi-Chi. He had to be that, like, father figure to Goten a little bit. Goten didn't know, and Gohan had to tell him, our father's great. He's like an angel, he's just a good fucking guy. He had to teach that to Gohan. He had to teach him about being a Saiyan. And he's like, let's train. You want to train, you can train with me. And he's doing that. And he showed, that he could train his brother up a little bit. And he did do that. At least in Dragon Ball Z. Then he went to go fight in the Tournament of Power and defend his family. And he did. He was one of the, 10 fighters from Universe 7. I'm fighting here so Goten doesn't get erased from the universe. Not specifically Goten, y'all. He had a daughter and everything else, but he cares about Goten too. And he did that partly for his brother too. He wasn't gonna let his brother, like, he wasn't gonna sit back and be like, no, I'm gonna go to work and not do this. My brother is, I'm gonna go fight instead of my brother because he can't even fight. You know, so Gohan's a good older brother. But at number 4, I have number 4. I have Katakuri from One Piece. Katakuri is a villain, right? But he's number one. Big Mom's number one most powerful. As a kid, he had fish-like teeth or sharp teeth and other things, and his brother was like, you shouldn't look like that, and then his sister got beat up. And then after that day, he was like, I'll cover my face up so, they won't fuck with my siblings no more. But I'll also beat their ass because they, fuck with my sister. And that's what he did, And he beat every enemy and fought every foe for all of his fucking siblings and shit, all of them, because he was the most powerful. He's like, I have to be strong for them. I have to be, and he's like, a conqueror too. He's, standing on business against Luffy. The only fight he lost and shit, where he like laid on his back. And he was like, and Luffy, feeling bad for him, was like, damn, I'll put this hat on your face so you ain't crying tears in front of your, family. Because they do look up to you and you are actually, a strong person in your own right, but I'm just slightly better. And then, he left and, but Katakuri was doing that shit for his family. He might have been the villain, but he was there for, that, you know, he could cause problems for my brothers and sisters, I'm fighting against him. And he fought Luffy for a really, like, that's one of the best fights that Luffy had. It was against this guy. But he's a good brother for sure. Number 3, I got Ace. Ace died for Luffy. You taking a bullet for your brother, you dying for your brother. He saved Luffy in Alabasta too against Smoker. Smoker was trying to hunt his dick, and then Ace was like, "No, you don't need to hunt him." Ace, died because of his, hot-headedness or whatever. But it could have been Luffy taking that hit. But Luffy, he jumped in the way, and Luffy ended up living. That's plot armor for Luffy. But also Ace did that. He could have easily let that shit hit him. Because he had already been burnt. But he was like, he jumped. He got there quick. Without thinking, he just. And it was a sad moment for every One Piece fan. But he's at number 3. He's not Ace. He ain't Luffy's real brother. Like, he is, but not biological is what I'm saying. They had different fathers and different mothers too. They made that sake drink. And that was, tough. And it was, a good way to save your brother, but, sad too. Very sad. But at number 2, I got Tanjiro. Tanjiro Kamado's at number 2 because that's basically what the series is about, Demon Slayer. Hopefully I get to see the movie tomorrow. I'm hoping, but, we'll see. Tanjiro did that so his sister could get better. He don't want his sister to live in a box or, only come out at night. He wants to get her right. He wants a way to get her back to being human so she doesn't have those, you have to fight those urges of needing to eat people or anything. He understands that his little sister's still going through it, even though she's alive, and she was the only one that was still alive, and he was like, I'll defend her. Rui tried to take her. He, fought against Rui. He, fought against, Tengu. He fought against, Yutaro and Daki, these upper moon demons, Muzan and, Akaza and all these people, right? To protect his sister, and he carries her around in a box, and they're the Komodo, family, what's left of it. He set out on the journey in the first place because of her, not because he wanted to become a demon slayer. He didn't want to, you know. He wanted to live in a hut and, live a peaceful life. But then shit got crazy and he, understood that he had to protect his sister and that he had to, get information about Muzan, who is the guy who, creates demons. And then Miss Tamio has a way to, get her, better, so, he's doing everything for his sister, to make her life better, to try to make her life better, and that's what Tanjiro is doing. But at number one, Edward Elric at number one, he tried to bring his mother back to life. Him and Al tried to do that, but it's taboo. So they ended up losing themselves. But Alphonse ended up losing his body. His soul got put onto some armor. Now that sounded cool, but then he doesn't know the feeling of any type of like human feeling. He doesn't have that. Like he ain't feeling anything. He wants to be human again. Edward didn't care if his arm or leg came back. He's like, brother, he's like, Alphonse, I don't give a fuck if I get my leg and arm back. I need you to have your body back because you haven't eaten food in years. You don't know what the feeling of like warmth and cold is. He did he fought all these people, looking for a way to get a philosopher's stone to, help bring his body back, the whole series. And he eventually did get his brother's body back, He had to grind hard for that shit too. And it's a great story, And he's actually a great older brother, and it's the same the other way too, actually. You could even say that Alphonse is a good brother to Ed, but I'm saying Ed because Ed's the older brother, and he's not a bad older brother. At no point was he like gonna quit on his brother. He wasn't gonna give up. He lost his mind when he was like, I can't get to Al. I won't let my brother, go away. That type of thing. Showed real concern for his brother. They even fight like brothers do and everything. He's like, they joke with each other. You're short, You're the short one. They think I'm the, Full Metal Alchemist, not you, Ed. And Ed's like, oh, well, it's me. And, he's getting upset a little bit. But, that's how brothers do. They pick on each other and shit. But they have that great connection. And it's been there. They never, took time away from each other or anything. Now, at the end of the series, they did. But that's them growing up into men because they were they're children, they're teenagers. But when they became men, they were like, brother, I'll be here, I'm gonna, look for things and discover things in the world, and you're gonna do this, and they ended off on a good note. Their story was, rough and other things, but they had a great ending. But that is the best brothers in anime as told by Darius the Green Angel. You can make your list in the comment section and let me know. But be cool, call in the corner.